Good morning, everybody. I'm Melisa Nielsen of Waldorf Essentials, talking about middle school physiology. And we're going to focus heavily on 7th grade because that's where we are right now with Samuel. And so those are the lessons that are the most fresh to me. So when we're getting ready to do 8th grade, we'll come back and do another one for 8th grade. But I will touch a bit about 8th grade today because I have taught it 3 other times. So I think one thing that, I have my notes over here, so that's why I'm looking down. But I think one thing that made a huge impact on me when I taught it the first time was the way Eric Fairman taught it. So Eric Fairman is a Waldorf teacher, and he has these guides called A Path of Discovery. And I purchased all of his guides like from 1st grade on, and he and I he and I cultivated a relationship, and he wrote the foreword in our grade 1 book. And so I really liked the way he sort of distilled some things. But these are not a full curriculum by any stretch. So they're just sort of his teacher notes and not for every lesson block. So I will say, when it came to teaching physiology the first time, I really wanted to figure out, like, okay, how do I bring this? Because my oldest is a boy, and it is different teaching this block to boys and girls, and I'll talk about why here in just a moment. But I wanted to bring it in a way that not only fulfilled what Steiner was thinking about, but also in a very sort of loving, respecting your body way. So I wanted it to be, I wanted it to be special. I think that, sorry, my hair is doing all kinds of crazy. I think that when we start this journey, we have ideas on how we're going to do things, but something as special as sort of this journey through the body, I think takes a lot more attention to detail than we generally would give it. And, a lot of moms say, gosh, why are you waiting until 7th grade to teach the birds and the bees in depth? And I want to stop and say, I don't bring up this conversation of where babies come from and how all that works, but they always ask by about 11. So if you live on a farm or you watch nature a lot, they're going to see animals in the springtime sort of doing that, and they're going to make observations and some judgments and have questions in their mind. So they're really going to have questions generally after the 9-year change. Before that, it's a very sort of fun and beautiful space to be, and very magical. So like Soraya and I were watching a bird documentary the other day, and it's on Netflix. It's really good. It was called Dancing of the Birds. And they were beautiful birds. They were like birds of paradise. They're all really pretty. And well, at least the male birds are really pretty. And then it was very interesting to see the female counterparts. So the whole thing was about these dances that the birds do to attract a mate. And in her mind, they're just attracting somebody to be married to and to help raise their babies. That's all she's thinking about, because she's not gone through that change yet. But after about 9, there starts to be like some questions for sure. So why do we wait until grade 7 to bring this whole physiology block? There's a couple of reasons, but one, I will say that when Steiner sort of envisioned this biology or physiology block 100 years ago, children were not going through puberty at 12. Things were a lot different than they are now with regards to how their bodies are physically developing. And so I think in some settings, it's definitely appropriate to bring some of this earlier. Would I bring all of it in the depth that I do to an earlier child? No, because maturity-wise, things are perfect around, age 13. They're just, they're still kind of a little bit in the childhood place, but they've got this like broader perspective on where they're going. At least they think they do. And, they might be looking at the opposite sex a little bit more. So they're going to be thinking about some of these things generally, not always. So it is a perfect time to bring it. But the ideas of how, I think, are, what we're going to cover today. I also want to say that when you have, do you have a question over there?
Nicole Schwartz says, we had surprise goat babies yesterday, and they have seen goats and donkeys mount each other. There have been many questions by my 8-year-olds.
I just say, yeah, they're just loving on each other. They're just loving on each other. I don't, because here's what I know. That question is often not the question of explain it all to me. So I generally tend to answer questions as they come up as simple as possible. So when I was pregnant with Sam, Jacob was 6. And so if you can imagine my belly and the height of a 6-year-old, he was just like eye height with my belly all the time. It was like he was just, every time he turned around, he was running into my belly. And I remember he said to me one time, we were standing in line at Home Depot, so not prepared for this. And the poor lady at Home Depot, I think she was like, oh my gosh, could y'all get out of my line as fast as possible? He goes, so just how did that baby get in there? And I was like, I said, let's go home and let's talk about this. So I just kind of avoided the question because I was stressed out about like, okay, 6, it's not really old enough for this conversation. And old enough in the respect that of all of the pieces. So now I know there are some families that are like, nope, you got to tell them all the nuts and bolts, everything as soon as they can talk. I am not that family, and you are welcome to swipe away if that's your thought and you think I'm doing a disservice. I'm bringing you what we do in the Nielsen house and what we teach. You are welcome to do something different. But so what ended up happening was I probed a little bit and asked him, like, what was he, what do you think? How do you think? And, I had him rubbing my belly and they were all very connected to Super Sam when he was in my belly. And to Soraya too. But I said, well, what do you think? And his question really was like, what was the magical process? Because you have this being growing in your belly. He didn't want to know about sex. He wanted to know what was the magical process of this baby being in there. So it's simple. I gave him a very simple answer. And he was very okay with that answer for probably 3 or 4 more years. So my answer was, well, Daddy and I love each other and God put this baby here. And he was like, oh, all right. Sometimes that question is not a begging for all of the information. Most of the time when they're under 9, that question is still from a very magical place. And of course, it very much depends on what your child has been exposed to. If your child has been exposed to other things, then of course they're going to have more questions. But, we keep, in our home, we keep it very much on the rated G level for as long as possible. And that can get much more challenging when you have older children that sort of want to push the envelope in front of the younger children. And I have no qualms about telling an older child to button it, that this is not a conversation to have around their younger siblings. You're welcome to follow me in the other room and we can talk about what you want to talk about there, but you're not going to talk about that in front of them. Because why? Because nobody was there to ruin it for you, so you are absolutely not going to ruin it for them. I'm very firm when it comes to some of those parenting pieces because it's a non-negotiable for me. It's a non-negotiable for how we raise our family and sort of how we do things in our home. Now, people will say to me, oh, well, I understand in your religion, you guys kind of don't do that. But you know what? I'm telling you, this was like before that. That's like my beliefs and thoughts about when to bring this and agreement about when to bring this supersede where my faith is. Because this was something that I already believed in before. And for those of you who don't know, I was raised Catholic. I spent my 20s pagan, and then I came back to Christianity. But these beliefs were in me even when I was, I was not Christian. So it had nothing to do with that. It really has to do with, for me, trusting Steiner and the absolute belief in human development and how bringing things at the correct time is what children need. And that has something that I have worked on, for all the years. My oldest is 22, our youngest is 8, and we've always had Waldorf in our home. And so it's something I have worked on all the time. So that's where this is coming from. It's definitely not coming from a religious perspective. From a religious perspective, we teach reverence for our bodies, and we teach that that what we're going to talk about in this block is something that should be saved for when you are truly, truly loving somebody. And I believe that the way that Eric Fairman brought this to me really spoke to me at that time because of the love and the care that he put into it. So he does start, and consequently I do too. And I teach this, it's in our grade 7 curriculum. Because I just love the way he sort of brought this together. He sort of starts with the beginning. He starts with creation stories. So children that are in 7th grade, you can bring them back to those creation stories from grade 3 and those creation stories from all the other cultures that you've studied up until grade 7. So talk about those things. He sort of suggests talking about Genesis and the very sort of iconic verses about, how God created man in his image and that kind of thing. But you could bring any of your faith, any of those things in for bringing this, because we're starting sort of at this base level of where did we come from? Not just where did those babies come from and how did they get there, but where did we come from? And these are questions that are going on in the 13-year-old's mind, even if they want to pretend that they're not. Like when Samuel knew that this is what we were doing, I said, would you rather have your dad teach this lesson block? He goes, no, I'd rather wait until I'm 30. I just started laughing. And it's really about these first few days because we talk about human reproduction. But after that, he was like, oh, this is easy. So those first few days only last a couple of, it's only a couple of days long. And so why do we start sort of with this like base space of where do we come from? Because it is a very nice segue into human reproduction, into relationships and talking about love and sort of where this baby comes from. It comes from this act of love. So human reproduction is for humans. So we're not talking about animal husbandry or animal reproduction. We're talking about human reproduction comes from a place of love, or it should come from a place of love, that we are loving being with this other person. Now, we're not talking about cases of rape or incest or anything like that in this, because that is a conversation for, again, an older child, or if that comes up. We definitely do talk about, gosh, this is really sad because somebody forced somebody to do this. But we can't have that conversation until we have this conversation about where it should be. Like, where's a healthy space for it to be? A healthy space for it to be comes from a place of love. So that's where we start. So we sort of start about this, like reviewing creation and reviewing how different faiths, and even though we have our belief of creation, we talk about all faiths and where they believe creation came from. And it's so nice because most of them kind of intersect in the middle. They kind of segue into one another. So we start there. And then what we did with Sam this year is we had done a geometry block before. I'm going to show you some of these are my main lesson props that he then copied, but I thought it was easier to bring mine. And because we had just come off of a geometry block, I thought it would be nice to sort of start with this, this idea that our body has these wonderful measurements that are, part of nature. So we had talked all about that, all about the different sequences and how they stack together. And, so we had done that. That was how we started in his cover, or his first page of his main lesson book for this block looks like this as well. So we started with that. And then we started with human reproduction. Now, we started with male anatomy because he's a boy. If he had been a girl, I would have started, when we did it with Ellie, we started with female anatomy. And I do have this conversation because, these kids are 13. Some of these girls have already started their periods. So I had the period conversation with Ellie when she was about 11. But that was not the whole dive into all of how everything happens. I said to her, this is what we have as women, and that's how we later can have a baby and have a baby grow in our belly. And I answered all of her questions. And that we also have a book. It's one put out by somebody from our faith, but it's a really good book. I would absolutely highly recommend at least checking it out on Amazon. I think there's some, like one of those look inside pages. It's called Where Do I Come From by Brad Wilcox. And it's very light, but it has questions and answers at the end. So often what I'll do, because it does sort of get wonky and a little uncomfortable if they're not ready to have that conversation with you, but you know they've got questions, I will just hand them the book, which is exactly what we did with Super Sam. When he was about 11, I could tell he had some questions. And I said, you know what, let's have you read this book and then let's talk about it. So he read the book. I don't think the book actually shed a ton of information for him because we had already been very open about answering questions, but he was glad that we were able to just give him a book to look at. And I said, do you want to have a chat with Dad or I? How are you feeling about that? Do you have any questions? Would you like me to give you paper so you can write down questions? And then Dad and I could answer them and we can write them down if it feels uncomfortable. Because I do think that sort of diving into this conversation as I don't even know the right word, as elegantly, there's that word again, elegantly, Daddy. We've been using that word a lot. As elegantly as possible, because you don't want them to close up. So I would rather be in a space of, hey, we're open, but would you like to keep a circle journal? Which a circle journal is a journal where you write things down and then you give it to them and then they write things down and they give it back. And we've kept those with our kids throughout the years, and they're a great way to answer questions, to get frustrations off their mind. I can remember many times Ellie was like, I really am mad at you. I really hate you. But I really don't want to say those things to you. So I'm writing it all down. And so, it was good. It was good for her to be able to express and not feel like she was, because she used to say, I always feel so bad afterwards because I love you so much. And so I wanted it to be a space where she could write and then we could just converse that way. It's sort of like coming in sideways. There are also books and I'm going to preface this by, I only know the last edition books. I don't know this current edition. I've had some people tell me the current edition is much more politically motivated and detailed. So I'm just going to say that you might want to check them out and read it thoroughly before giving it to your child. But the American Girl company puts out a series of books that's about like what it is to be a girl and answers a lot of questions. And Ellie really liked those books, and she had them probably at around 12. That's when she really, sort of dove into those. So that was about when she started her period at 11 or 12. And so we do have this lower level conversation, but this conversation that we're having in 7th grade is from a much different place. So we're talking about how does humanity come about, and how would it be, even if it's not always this way, wouldn't it be lovely if everybody brought children into the world from a loving place? And isn't that a wonderful way to be able to look at things, even if that's not your reality? Wouldn't it be wonderful? So, yes, somebody said to me the week before I was doing this, what are you doing? I said, I'm drawing penises today. So I go through, and we did them in years past. I've sometimes printed off a worksheet and we just labeled the worksheet. But I thought there was a lot of value in actually drawing it. So we did a lot of drawing. So we did that. And then the next day we did the female reproduction. Yes, dear.
Nicole Dorsey says that they have a boy book too.
You know what? I heard that, and I think the boy book is new. So again, I would go And on your date night, like Eric and I often go to Barnes & Noble, and just sit there and read it and make sure that it is something that feels comfortable to you and feels like you can hand to your son or your daughter. I think that it's great that there are books like that, because while I absolutely believe there is so much value in having the conversation with them, like speaking from your mouth, it's not always comfortable for every child. And I will tell you, it's kind of funny. My oldest, who has autism, it was almost easier to have the conversation with him because he had questions that he wasn't really afraid to ask me, because or like he didn't really feel super weird about asking them. And so it was very matter of fact, which is what autism often is. It's very matter of fact when we had these conversations. So for him, and he was the first one that I taught, bringing it from a place of love spoke to me a lot, because of how I needed for him to sort of come down out of his head and come down into his heart. And so the cover of his main lesson book was this heart painting that we did. And because I wanted him to very much be in this feeling place as we were talking about it. Okay. And then we also did a day on, how the egg and the sperm come together, and we labeled the parts of the sperm. We talked about like what determines the sex of the baby. And I think this is an important conversation that segues then into your Renaissance, into your Renaissance lessons. And here's why, because you might be like, what are you talking about? Because those kings all wanted a boy child. And we look at how often in history women were cast off because they couldn't produce a male heir. Well, we have this conversation when we're doing physiology. Oops, not that page anymore. But when we're doing physiology, we have this conversation about it's dad that chooses. Those swimmers are what chooses whether or not it's a boy or girl. So it's very good segue into then what you're going to do, because we're heading into the Renaissance and we're starting with religious movements first. So it's a very good segue into that space. Yes, Daddy.
Oh, Becca Joy says, the Care and Keeping of You by A.G., the original, was very helpful to me as an older teen when I was needing factual and unbiased help with terminology and care advice. I already have it bought and set aside for when my girls need it in a few years.
Yeah, that's right. That was the title, The Care and Keeping of You. And it's put out by the American Girl Company. If you go into, like, I can see exactly where it is in Barnes & Noble. There's a big spot for it. And there's a lot of those books there. Okay, so then we went into the respiratory system. So those first few days, he was like, whew, now we can talk about the rest of the body. But those first few days, we really focus on that reproduction space. And then we focused on pregnancy a bit too. So I have some great resources from when I was, studying to be a midwife that show the baby at different stages. And I didn't bring it down here with me, but we talked about why it's important for a baby to be full term and what happens when they're not. And Soraya, our youngest, was a preemie, and one of the things that they were concerned about at first was her lung development. So we talk about that. We talk about lung development and how it's sort of the last thing to really develop, and what happens when it's not developed. So we talked a little bit about that. And we talked a little bit about, okay, so full lungs, this is what happens. They take this jog down the birth canal. So we were able to, because of how we approached this block, and we approached it from this place of love, then you're making a baby, what happens with the baby? We looked at every system from that perspective. Every system. So the circulatory system, the digestive system, all of that. We looked at all of that from how does it start when you're an infant? And how is it developing as they're in those last few weeks of pregnancy, and then when they're first born. So we talked about the respiratory system, and we did a regular more adult drawing of that, but we had this conversation about, why is it really important? And we talked about what parts are not developed in the infant if they're born too soon, and what that shot that they give moms sometimes to help those lungs develop at the very end if they're having a preemie, and all of those things. We talked about all of that. We talked about how small his little sister was versus the rest of them. So it gave us a really good space to sort of talk about all of those things with regards to pregnancy. And we have a friend who's pregnant. And I said, would you like to go rub Miss Jenna's belly? And he's like, no. So, but when Ellie was in that space, she was all over it. She was like, yes, I want to do that. And I want to see moms and babies. She was very, very connected to moms and babies. My boys, not so much. So, and that's okay. Did you have anything over there?
No.
Okay. All right. So then we move on to the circulatory system and the heart. So we did, this is a pretty iconic drawing of just the heart. And I will tell you, so I had done this prop and then I walked away to do something while Samuel was doing it, and he's colorblind. And these shades are really close to each other. So there are some parts of his picture where I'm like, oh, dude, that was not blue. He's like, just scribbling over it as, red. So, in retrospect, I would have sat next to him the whole time. And that's exactly what I did when we got to the next pieces. So then we did the nervous system, and we talked about the skin. But we talked about with the nervous system too was how that jog down the birth canal wakes all those senses up. And when you don't have that jog down the birth canal via either C-section or, a baby that is born preemie like Soraya was, there are different things that either need to be done. They spend a lot of time rubbing this baby down, getting all of those senses woken up. And there are, like Soraya has sensory processing disorder. And I fully believe it was because she had this, she was one push, very precipitous. Once it got going, I remember the doctor said, okay, it's time to push now. Because by that time, because I had been in labor for a long time, I was like, yes, epidural. Now, listen, I have 5 children. I've had ones with and ones without. So by the time we were in that last stage, I was like, all right, well, I'm going to be at this a while. This is a 5th baby. Everybody else took more than an hour to push out. I've got this. One push. It took me longer to birth the placenta than it did to birth her. So we talk about this jog down the birth canal and what it does, the squeezing that happens to the baby on its way out, and how that's really important to wake all of those senses up, and what happens when that doesn't happen. Because, there are babies that are born C-section for a variety of reasons all the time, or babies that are born preemie. How does that show up later? Because often we don't think about how that shows up later. And a mom that has sort of this informed consent or understands, she's then watching for those things and how they might show up later, and being sort of preemptive on things so that she knows she's paying attention to knowing how to feed that system that maybe did not get fully turned on. And then we talked about the digestive system, and in that we do talk about what's our best first food. So again, we're tying it right back to where we started, infancy, and that brings up the question why does not everybody breastfeed? Why do some moms choose the bottle? Why do some moms have to choose the bottle? What happens when there's a child that's been adopted? It brought all of those things out, and I think it's very important. We have these conversations often with our girls, but I think it's a very important conversation to have with our boys, and sort of helping them to understand that they are very important in this role when they grow up and they have a family. They're very important in this role as to whether or not their wives breastfeed and what support role they can have for that. So we have this, this conversation that I think is pretty darn important one. So those were the systems that we covered. What about muscles and bones, and what about all the other things? So those are in 8th grade. So I was going to look at my list here. In 7th grade, we cover sort of just this systems situation but we don't cover the nervous system incomplete, because we're not covering the brain. until 8th grade. So we talk about the brain a little bit and how the brain controls a lot of things, but we don't really cover it in depth until 8th grade. You could probably cover it in 7th grade, but y'all are not going to have time. You have so many other things to cover. So Eric Fairman took 15 days on this lesson block. I think I condensed it to 9 lessons, but ours were longer lessons. And, you know, being at home, we had the opportunity to do more and discuss them longer. We definitely did some of the experiments. So experiments being when we talked about the respiratory system, I had him breathe through a straw, like different size straws, so that he could understand what it feels like to not get a full breath in. I have asthma. So like breathing through a coffee straw is sometimes how it felt. And so we talk about that, and we talk about the role of humidity, and we talked about the role of how, you know, having illnesses in the lungs can really affect, you know, being able to get a breath in. We talked about, remember the last time you had a cold and your nose was all stuffed up? We talked about all of those things. So this gives you an opportunity to really bring in so much with regards to health, what your values are with eating. When we talked about the digestive system, we talked a little bit, not a ton, because this is a layering process. I did not want to overwhelm him. We talked about the effects of too much sugar. We talked about the effects of not eating well. We talked about how we eat and the things that we buy, and sometimes we fall off, buy things like Butterfingers. Thank you, Halloween. Halloween, I hate you. And how we generally, our mainstay is, you know, fruit, vegetables, how we eat, and why that's different than how other people eat, and how, you know, the digestive system really needs these good things in it to work properly. So it gives you this opportunity to have this conversation at a very good time. 13 is a perfect age to have this conversation. So then at 14, your conversation is going to shift to muscles and bones, which I highly recommend Charles Kovac's book, Muscles and Bones. We used the first part of it as reading material for 7th grade. And then there's a whole section that will be perfect for 8th grade. So muscles and bones, the eye, body chemistry. We also do the ear in 8th grade, and again, the brain. I found this really cool. I was looking for things for the nervous system. So if you're in 8th grade, maybe you go look for this. It was on Pinterest, and it was this brain hat that you make. You like print it out, and then you color all the different areas in, and you put it on your head, and it sort of shows like where everything in the brain was. I thought it was funny. Samuel was like, don't make me draw that. So that's 8th grade. So I hope this has been helpful. I know that this can be like a really daunting space, you know, especially if you've been following Waldorf all this time. You know, it builds. After 2nd grade, you're like, oh, 3rd grade is more. And then you're like, oh, 4th grade, more. 5th grade, holy crap, more. 6th grade, are you kidding me? And then you get to 7th grade and you're like, oh my gosh, there's so much information and so much to do and so much to prepare for. But I'm telling you, do it right. Do your planning, take your time, refine your practice, and you will find that it is not as hard as you think it is. Just step by step. You know, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Cannot do the whole thing. My words about overwhelm, like I said, I've been with our business coach for the beginning of last week, and he talked about overwhelm. So when you're in the space of overwhelm, you've got a couple of options. One, you can broaden the space of time and give yourself a bigger container of time to, whether it be to learn something, to do the main lesson block, or what have you. Or you have to edit some things, and it's okay to edit. So understanding sort of what the essence is really important, so that when you understand the essence, then you can go, okay, well, I can do the essence in half the lessons. Or can I do the essence in half the lessons? Or can we have longer lessons during these days so that we can get them in, and shorter lessons on other days? On these days, could we maybe, skip math this day and do math on Saturday instead, so that I can get all of this essence in? Stop with the overwhelm. Just breathe deep and tell yourself, you either have to change the container of time, change what you're trying to put into it, or this is the best. Change how you're looking at it. if you choose to be overwhelmed, which is a choice, then you've got to decide, can I change the way I look at it? Or can I change the container of time or the amount that I'm trying to squeeze in here? So that's my closing thought for today. I hope you have a wonderful week.